Working in Princeton, going through the pandemic, what was the role that the institution played? What was it like to be in an academic setting during something so unique?
Well, it was a surreal moment for a lot of us academics, especially those academics like myself who work internationally, right? So all of a sudden we were sort of disconnected from our international networks. I spend a lot of time each year in Europe and in the Middle East, and so to go about 2 years not to visit our colleagues in Europe, our colleagues in the Middle East, that was just a little bit, I would say, painful and concerning. Of course, we adapted to the hybrid environment and trying to move remotely, but there's no substitute for in-person meetings and working face-to-face, especially for those of us who do field work. We were sort of energized by seeing people and working with people face-to-face in the field, engaging them, learning from them, speaking with them. It's just kind of like, as academics, this is what inspires us to push forward and to continue doing our work. So for 2 years, I would say, if you ask me my personal opinion, I think it was a moment where we were sort of reevaluating, will we be able to get back to work as usual in ways that inform our scholarship and our academic progress?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting point I want to raise on academics. At the beginning of the pandemic and throughout, to be perfectly honest, we were able to see a bit more clearly is it fair to say, the disconnect with the American public and experts? There was this strange conflict almost between experts in the field and the regular person on the street, driven by a number of factors, but we won't go into details. What was your sense of that?
Yeah, it was unfortunate. I mean, just to sort of get to the heart of the problem, the whole COVID debate was politicized in America from the onset. It was politicized in ways that I think were irresponsible for the public health of the American public, but also to the extent that the U.S. thinks of itself as a place that sort of shapes world debates, or at least contributes to world debates on how a global community needs to combat the pandemic. I think it was very unfortunate to have seen the events transpire as they did in the United States. First of all, there was the escalation of xenophobia linked to the pandemic by calling it the China virus and basically causing a lot of enormous stress to our Asian American populations in the United States. As a Muslim who lives in the United States, I'm very sensitive to xenophobia, and to see this happening was very uncomfortable, because all of a sudden it was almost that Americans were going to become immune to this China virus and we should just blame the Chinese for it. So that was very unfortunate. Second, it was unfortunate that from the very beginning, the public health, the responsible public health response, whether it was about masking or vaccinations or social distancing, that was seen as sort of a political ploy of the liberal left. And then basically the right sort of combated with saying, we don't have to worry about that. It wasn't until we saw that the levels of COVID escalated dramatically in states that were leaning red and the hospitals were filled, that people began to realize that this was a public health liability, and sort of started imposing the mandates, the mask mandates, the social distancing, and things of that sort. So it's sort of unfortunate that this played out the way it did in the United States.
Yeah, and from a response perspective, there were a couple of major nations. I think the US certainly was one of them as well. The UK was another one that responded a little slowly.
Right.
We have lessons to learn if we ever find ourselves in a position like this again, but what do you think can be learned from a political perspective based on what you just said?
I think from the political perspective, I mean, my hope, which is I'm not sure we're going to get there, but my hope is that scientific facts will sort of overcome the polarized political environment, right? But the whole idea is that science in of itself now has become politicized, right? Science versus hoax. I mean, this gets at a bigger problem, in my opinion, which is the role of fake news and misinformation and the sort of information capitalism campaign that sort of sponsors or at least benefits from the fake news circulating amongst our midst. We still, in some segments of American society, there's a strong belief that the vaccination have political motives behind them that might sort of lead to either depopulation or have other negative consequences which are not founded by facts. Again, this is like located in the fake news industry. So this is something that, this is, I think, the bigger problem. Yeah. How do we as societies, global communities, overcome the problem of fake news and misinformation now that everybody has access to sort of information and information overload, where people can't sort of, unfortunately, sometimes on their own, discriminate against accurate information and inaccurate information. How do we sort of tackle that problem? This is a big issue, I think, that we're all going to contend with as a global community moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. The pandemic, obviously, there wasn't really anyone, it didn't discriminate, let's put it that way.
Yes.
But there was particular reasons where you could say they were hit harder because of the situation on the ground at the time.
Absolutely.
The Middle East is one of those.
Right.
How do you summarize the situation now? We're sort of hopefully in the recovery phase.
Right.
How would you summarize the impact on populations in different parts of the Middle East?
So, I mean, yeah, this is a really important question. I think we're still going to be analyzing the consequences of the pandemic on the Middle East for years to come. What we sort of know initially is that the economic consequences of the pandemic in countries that were already struggling economically has just exacerbated the situation, whether we're looking at Lebanon or Jordan or Tunisia, for example, places like Yemen, right? These places were already struggling economically, and now you had the pandemic that really sort of set things way behind. So that's one area. When we have these economic struggles, they have a disproportionate effect on youth employment patterns, right? Because again, youth employment is sort of directly linked to the global, the global economy and how Middle Eastern states are integrated in the global economy. The pandemic further removed that, which means we're going to see the trickle-down effects on our youth populations. Third, female employment, right? It was already a struggle for many women to get into the labor force, not because, a lot of people will argue, and this is some research that we did in Jordan, a lot of people will argue that it's cultural barriers that prevent women from accessing the labor force. What we see are, like in places like Qatar, right, the cultural gap or the female-male gap has sort of been reduced. We see far more females right now in the labor force than we did a decade ago, or even 2 decades ago. In Jordan, you see a higher percentage of women accessing higher education and earning degrees. So the gaps in terms of higher education are also closing. The labor market has not kept up with female education rates, right? Because as women will tell us in our interviews and our work, it costs them more to find adequate babysitting and daycare and transportation. That's going to cost them more than what they'll make in the labor force. So until the labor force can keep up with the employment needs of our female population, women will opt to stay out of the labor force. Factor in the pandemic, where children were at home.
Yeah.
And women had to stay home to sort of oversee the hybrid education of their children. It meant that a lot of women dropped out of the labor force. So we already had the lowest percentage of, if we look globally, the lowest percentage of women globally who are in the labor force are Middle Eastern women. You have the pandemic that removed even women from the labor force. So this is a big consequence. And if you buy into the model that female empowerment, and female sort of acquisition to human capital and political capital and social capital is driven by education and labor force participation, this is going to be a huge setback for females in the region.
Yeah, wow, I've not heard that perspective before. That's fascinating.
Yes.
You talk about research. Let's talk a little bit about the Arab Barometer. How important a tool is that, and what has it told us, not just from the pandemic, but also I think the last decade, about a decade ago or more, when we started seeing a lot of movement on the ground in many countries around the region, when we had the uprisings. It seemed as though there was going to be a big decade of change. How much change has there been? Would it be fair to say, and you tell me, that there hasn't been as much change as we would have liked?
That's an excellent question. And so once anybody asks me about the Arab Barometer, I do take my time. So
the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So the Arab Barometer was, conceived by a bunch of us academics back in the early 2000s in the United States. This is at a time when the U.S. was preparing for war in Iraq. And what we were sort of perplexed by, or sort of at least very skeptical of, is this notion that there was this monolithic Arab street. Everybody was talking in the United States about the Arab street, as if it was either leaning towards Saddam Hussein or Al-Qaeda, or where was the Arab public vis-a-vis the rise of terrorism and radicalization. And for those of us doing research in the Middle East, we knew that there was no such thing as a monolithic unified Arab street. You have a lot of diversity in terms of perspective of Arab citizens across the region, of women, of men, of younger generation, older generation. People sort of understand Islam differently. So there's this idea that you can just talk about an Arab public as such, we thought was sort of inaccurate. So how do we sort of correct this misconception? Well, we have to have data. And it's just remarkable that by 2000, everybody was talking about the Arab street, but there was no reliable data about the Arab street. Every other region had a barometer, right? Latino barometer, Asian barometer, the Africa barometer. We did not have a barometer. So a bunch of us said, let's try to survey our own populations. A, we need it for academic scholarship, but B, clearly the policy realm, the policy community will benefit from these data. Of course, you have to get funding, you have to be able to conduct these surveys, but I'm very happy to say that we are now preparing to conduct to execute the 7th wave of the Arab Barometer data. So we've been in operation for 15 years. So for 15 years now, we have data across 12 to 13 countries in the region, across different time periods, so we can document changes of opinion across time. And to get you to your question, what has changed in the last decade? So I'll tell you what's changed in the last decade, unfortunately. Two things. When we looked at the Arab Spring, there was a lot of optimism around this quote-unquote democratic moment, or the potential of this democratic moment. And indeed, when we surveyed individuals across the region, young, old, women, female, male, employed, unemployed, there was a lot of enthusiasm around the Arab Spring because the idea was that in this new era of democracy, there was going to be a new era of economic and social dignity for citizens. When citizens talk about economic dignity, what do they mean? They mean that they want to be able to sort of subsist and support their children, make sure that their children are growing up in not necessarily luxury, but sufficiently, be able to feed your children sufficiently in a dignified manner. And so a lot of people in the Arab world will equate democracy with this idea of social justice. That in social justice, there's economic dignity. In democracy, therefore, there should be economic dignity. What we saw with the Arab Spring is that a bunch of countries, or several countries, moved to sort of elections. As you know, the elections were fraught. Some of those elections returned results that some people were worried about. In Egypt, we saw the Muslim Brotherhood winning the elections. Tunisia and Nahda. In other places, there was concern about those elections. But nevertheless, what we lost sight of is that citizens were less invested in the type of regime. As you saw, even in Egypt, secularists voted for the Muslim Brotherhood. What they wanted was regime change and a new chance at ending corruption and sort of a way to sort of instigate and enhance economic development, transparency, fairness, equality, a reduction of income inequalities, things of that sort, things that, every citizen, when we think about a global citizen, this is what the citizens of the region were sort of hoping for. Unfortunately, elections and democracy and experiments with democracy didn't bring those economic results. So you look at most of the Arab Spring countries, unfortunately, whether we look at Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, Tunisia, which became the poster child story of the Arab Spring because it transitioned to democracy successfully. It met the sort of threshold of 2 consecutive democratic elections. That's how you define it. So it was really sort of moving towards institutionalized democracy. If you look at the per capita GDP of Tunisians, it was higher in 2010 than it is today. It was higher under Ben Ali than it is today. So democracy has brought just economic anguish. A decade later, real purchasing power is much lower than what it was under Ben Ali's authoritarianism. So when we survey the average Tunisian today, they're like, I don't care about to be fair, democracy has not brought us the economic dignity that we wanted. So that's why we've seen the support for democracy decline. Not because Tunisians weren't true Democrats, because democracy did not deliver the economic rewards that were linked to a democratic push at the time.
And so what's the alternative that they're looking at then?
So right now, what we've seen in Tunisia recently is that there's been sort of like this democratic reversal, a little bit more authoritarian consolidation. What we're seeing in our public opinion data is that citizens are beginning to look to China to say, look, China is a successful authoritarian regime. The average, the average income of the average Chinese person since 2000, their income has gone up about 200%. In real per capita purchasing power, wow. Right? So maybe democracy is not the right choice. Sure. Maybe we need better technocratic leaders or strong leaders that can sort of usher in economic development. This is certainly what Sisi is promising the Egyptian population, for example, in Egypt. So this is something that we're keeping our eye on as we move forward in terms of thinking about our surveys.
Wonderful. I want to just finish by going slightly back towards education.
Yes,
because you
please.
talked about we talked about above and beyond education.
Right.
And in many parts of the region, as you said, women are getting into education. Certain parts of the region, they're more qualified than their male counterparts.
Right.
In other parts, still very difficult. I looked at Afghanistan. Yeah. We've heard a lot about the troubles under Taliban rule. Yeah. Just a couple of days ago, we saw some incredible images of young girls marching for their right to education there. What did you think of those images, those videos, the bravery? What does that mean? And what does the sort of future look like for young girls in Afghanistan?
So I'll tackle this question on both. I'll start with the Afghanistan question. I think it's really heartbreaking what's happening in Afghanistan. And this is where I think the global community needs to sort of stand unified to sort of insist and pressure the Taliban not to reverse the rights of these young women. These young women have taken, huge sort of, have paid huge costs to enter the educational field, to invest in their education, and now that's being pulled back by this regime. It's just unthinkable. And we're not in an era where we can just sit by and say, oh, this is okay. So we need to think of ways, how do we engage the Taliban regime without legitimating its rule? I mean, this is the key concern, but insisting that women are able to maintain their educational access, their employment access. Otherwise, the whole country will be pulled back drastically. So this is, and again, in these conflicts, we see that women become the politicized objects of different political leaders. And so we need to resist this and say that leave the women alone, let them sort of access their education, let them continue. It's important for us as a global community to stand behind the women of Afghanistan. We can't let 12 and 13-year-old girls lead this sort of effort on their own while the global community just sort of looks in and says, oh, this is just too bad. We need to step up right now. And this is where the internationals need to step up, I think, a little bit more as well. On the issue of employment in the Middle East, here's the issue, right? If you look at the last decade of the Middle East as well, we've had a lot of instability and political conflict in our region, right? Political conflict and instability is not conducive to economic development or globalization or the flow of international investment in terms of nascent political economies and things of that sort. So what we have right now is the region is not attracting much global investment. The labor market demands are not keeping up with the human capital access that our youth have in the region. Our youth are very overqualified for a labor market cannot meet their demands. Yep. That's why when we survey youth almost in every single country outside of the Gulf, there is a strong desire to immigrate to the West. Now, we also know that, immigration to the West has its other problems, the rise of Islamophobia. It's, just looking at the debate about, the debate as was pointed out by the Emir in terms of, how the West has absorbed the Ukrainian refugees versus, let's say, the Syrian refugees or the Iraqi refugees. You see a very different narrative around that. So there are pressures here for our youth to find adequate employment. The conflict has not helped. Of course, the regimes are also not necessarily, unfortunately not moving in the right direction in terms of thinking about the adequate labor markets that will sort of absorb the excellent human capital that we see in the region. I just saw a study that basically estimated almost 80% of all youth who hold higher degrees in Tunisia are struggling to find employment. This is, again, our poster child success story of democracy. 80% of all university degree holders among the youth population cannot find adequate jobs. That's just shocking. And of course, that 80%, where are they going to go? They're hoping for opportunities in the West. So I don't like to end always on a negative note, but
No, it's
it's not necessarily a wonderful moment right now for our youth in terms of thinking about how the political economies of the Middle East will absorb the talents of our youth.
Because assumingly as well that situation might, and this would be a tragedy in itself, then reflect poorly on the progress that's been made in education, right? If the generation before is thinking, well, it's not worth my time, my money, my effort to go through higher education if it's not going to get me anywhere, then you go backwards from an education perspective as well.
That's a big concern, especially because higher education really does cost families a significant amount of investment.